The ground shook so hard that my teeth rattled, and I pressed my back against the crumbling wall, while chunks of concrete rained down on my helmet. 3 seconds. That was how long I had before the next Vreth mortar round turned this corner of the forward base into dust. I counted in my head the way my grandfather taught me. 1, 2. The blast hit 20 meters to my left, and the shockwave slammed me sideways into a broken support beam. My rifle was empty. My comm unit was dead. And somewhere in the smoke ahead of me, I could hear the wet, clicking footsteps of a Vreth shock trooper moving through the wreckage. I reached for my sidearm, but the holster was crushed. The fall had bent the retention clip inward, and the weapon was jammed tight against my hip. I pulled twice, and the holster tore free from my belt entirely, but the pistol stayed locked inside like it had been welded shut. I threw the useless thing aside and looked down at what was left on my belt. A water canister, a broken field light, and the sword. My name is Elias Vane. I was a corporal in the Terran Attachment, which was a polite way of saying I was a human observer assigned to the Solari Vanguard, because the Pact of 12 decided that humans needed to earn their seat at the table before they could actually sit in it. We had been part of the coalition for 3 years, and in that time, I had learned 2 things. First, the Solari were the most efficient soldiers in the galaxy. Second, they did not care whether a human lived or died. The clicking footsteps grew louder. I could hear the Vreth breathing now, a low, rumbling sound like wet gravel being crushed under a boot. I had seen what they did to prisoners. There would be no capture. There would be no mercy. The Vreth did not take prisoners because they did not recognize other species as worth keeping alive. I drew the sword. It was not much to look at. The blade was 30 inches of old earth steel, and a deep crack ran diagonally across its width, about 8 inches from the tip. The crack had been filled with a crude repair alloy that my grandfather had forged himself in his workshop back in Lancaster. The alloy was a dull gray against the darker steel, and it looked exactly like what it was, a patch job. A fix made by a man who refused to throw something away just because it was broken. The sword had been in my family for over 200 years. It was forged during the Partition Wars, the last great civil conflict on Earth, before humanity looked up at the stars and decided there were better things to fight over. My great-great-grandfather carried it into battle at the Siege of Dover, and it shattered against a barricade when he used it to pry open a blast door. His son kept the pieces. His grandson, my grandfather, put them back together with an alloy he mixed in a coffee can over a propane burner. Tungsten, carbon nanofiber, and something else. A trace element he found in a meteorite fragment he bought at a flea market. He never figured out what it was. He just knew it made the alloy hold. He gave me the sword the night before I shipped out. He pressed it into my hands and looked at me with those steady gray eyes and said, "What has been broken and still holds is stronger than what has never been tested." The other soldiers laughed at it. The Solari thought it was a toy. The Kethoran warriors, who carried plasma-edged war axes that could cut through hull plating, looked at my cracked steel blade and did not even bother to mock it. They simply pretended it did not exist, and on most days, I agreed with them. It was a relic, a sentimental piece of junk that had no place on a modern battlefield. But my rifle was empty, my pistol was jammed, and the Vreth was 10 meters away. The shock trooper came through the smoke like a moving wall. The Vreth were massive, each one standing nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and a body covered in bioarmor that grew directly from their skin. The armor was a living crystalline lattice, dark green and iridescent, harder than anything the Coalition had been able to crack in 4 years of war. I had watched plasma bolts bounce off Vreth bioarmor like rain off a window. I had seen kinetic rounds flatten against their chests without leaving a scratch. No Coalition soldier had ever killed a Vreth in close combat. Not the Solari with their neural blades. Not the Kethoran with their plasma axes. Nobody. The creature saw me and stopped, its 4 eyes locked onto the sword in my hand, and I swear I saw something in its expression that might have been amusement. It made a sound, a low, grinding vocalization that I had learned was the Vreth equivalent of laughter. Then it charged. I did not think. I did not plan. I just moved. The Vreth swung one of its massive arms in a wide arc, and I ducked under it and drove the sword forward with everything I had. I aimed for the gap between the chest plates, the only spot where the bio-armor looked slightly thinner. The blade hit the armor, and instead of bouncing off, instead of shattering the way every other weapon in the galaxy had, the cracked steel sank in. I felt the resistance give way like a pane of glass fracturing under pressure. The bio-armor split along fault lines that radiated outward from the point of impact, and the sword slid into the hilt. The breath made a sound I had never heard before, not the grinding vocalization of their language, not the rumbling breath of their exertion. This was high-pitched and ragged, and it tore through the air like a scream. It was pain, pure, unfiltered, animal pain. The creature staggered backward, and I held onto the sword and let it pull me forward. Then it fell. I stood over it, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely keep my grip on the hilt. Dark fluid pooled around the body. The bio-armor around the wound was cracked in a web pattern, like a windshield after a rock strike. The crystalline lattice had not just been pierced, it had been shattered from within. I pulled the blade free and stared at it. The crack was still there, the ugly gray alloy still visible, but the steel was coated in Vreth blood, and the blade was intact. Behind me, I heard a weak voice. Human. I turned. Commander Tysa was pinned under a collapsed beam 15 feet away. She was Solari, tall and angular, with skin the color of polished bronze and eyes like black glass. I had served under her for 7 months, and in that time she had spoken directly to me exactly 4 times. She was not cruel, she simply did not consider me relevant. "Help me," she said. I could have run. The base was falling. The Solari had retreated with their usual clinical efficiency, pulling back to secondary positions, without bothering to check whether the human attachment had kept up. I was alone, behind enemy lines, in a collapsing structure. Every survival instinct told me to move. I went to Tysa instead. The beam was heavy, reinforced with some Solari composite material that weighed 3 times what it should have for its size. I braced my shoulder under it and pushed. My legs screamed. My back felt like it was going to snap. But the beam shifted, just enough, and Tysa dragged herself free. Her left leg was broken. I could see the bone pressing against the skin beneath her uniform. "Can you walk?" I asked. "No." I pulled her arm over my shoulder and lifted. She was lighter than a human of her size would have been, but she was still tall enough that I had to hunch to keep her balanced. We moved through the wreckage, and I could hear more Vreth footsteps in the corridors ahead. "You killed one," Tysa said. Her voice was flat, but there was something underneath it that I could not identify. "With that blade?" "Yes." "That is not possible." "I know." We made it through a collapsed section of the east corridor, climbed over a pile of rubble that used to be the medical bay, and found a gap in the perimeter wall that was just wide enough to squeeze through. The night air hit us like cold water, and I could see the lights of the Coalition's secondary line half a mile ahead. I half-carried Tysa across the open ground, my legs burning, the broken sword still gripped in my free hand. We reached the line. The Solari guards looked at us with expressions I could not read. One of them took Tysa from me without a word, and carried her to the medical station. I stood there, breathing hard, covered in dust and Vreth blood, holding a cracked sword that should not have been able to cut warm butter. Tysa looked back at me from the stretcher. Her black eyes found the blade in my hand, and she stared at it for a long time. Then she looked at me, and for the first time in 7 months, Commander Tysa of the Solari Vanguard looked at me like I was real. "Do not clean that blade," she said. "I want the science division to see it exactly as it is." Then they carried her away, and I was alone again, standing in the dark with the sound of the dying base burning behind me and a sword that had just done the impossible. I did not sleep that night. I sat on a supply crate behind the medical tents and held the sword across my knees and tried to understand what had happened. 4 years of war. 4 years of the best weapons in the galaxy, bouncing off Vreth bioarmor like pebbles off a tank, and a cracked piece of earth steel, held together with backyard alloy, had gone through it like a needle through cloth. It did not make sense. By morning, word had spread. Not because I told anyone, but because Tysa told her superiors, and her superiors told theirs. And within 6 hours, my name was being spoken in command meetings that I did not even know existed. I found this out when 2 Solari military police arrived at my bunk and told me to come with them immediately. They brought me to a room deep inside the Coalition's command bunker, a place I had never been allowed to enter. The walls were lined with holographic displays, showing the state of the war across 9 star systems, and every single display was red. We were losing. Everyone knew it, but seeing it mapped out like that, system by system, planet by planet, made it feel like a physical weight on my chest. 6 officers sat around a curved table, 2 Solari, 2 Peluri, the Coalition's diplomat species, shorter and rounder, with skin that shifted color when they were nervous. 1 Keth Oron, massive and scarred, wearing ceremonial armor that looked like it had been through a dozen wars. And 1 human, Colonel Linda Marsh, the ranking officer of the Terran attachment, who looked like she had not slept in 3 days. Tysa was there too, seated in a medical chair, with her leg in a regeneration brace. She nodded at me when I entered. It was the most acknowledgement she had ever given me in public. Corporal Vane, the senior Solari officer, said. His name was Director Kale, and he was in charge of Coalition ground forces for the Orden system. Commander Tysa reports that you killed a Vreth shock trooper in close combat using a blade weapon. Is this accurate? Yes, sir. Describe what happened. I told them. Every detail. The empty rifle, the jammed pistol, the desperate thrust, the way the bio-armor cracked instead of holding, the sound the Vreth made when the blade went in, the web pattern fracture around the wound. When I finished, the room was quiet. Warlord Drennick, the Ketharan, leaned forward. He was enormous, even by his species standards, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then hit with a hammer. "Show me the blade," he said. I drew it and laid it on the table. The Vreth blood had dried to a dark crust along the edge, and the crack with its ugly gray repair alloy was clearly visible. Drennick stared at it for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was a deep, booming sound that echoed off the walls. "This is what killed a Vreth?" he said. "A child's toy glued back together? I have seen better craftsmanship in a scrapyard." The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Colonel Marsh caught my eye and gave me a look that said, "Hold your ground." "With respect, Warlord," I said, "that child's toy did something your plasma axes have not managed in 4 years." Drennick's eyes narrowed. The Ketharan were proud beyond reason, and questioning their combat prowess was roughly equivalent to questioning their right to exist. For a moment, I thought he was going to come across the table at me, but instead, he just made a dismissive sound and sat back. "Let the scientists play with it," he said. "When they find nothing, I will enjoy the silence." Director Kale ordered the sword sent to the Coalition's Science Division on Orden 4's secondary base. The division was run by the Peluri, who were not warriors, but were the finest analytical minds in the Pact of 12. I was told to go with it. For 3 days, I sat in a sterile laboratory while a team of Peluri researchers ran every test they could think of on my grandfather's sword. Spectral analysis, molecular imaging, stress testing, resonance scanning. I watched them work with the meticulous patience of their species, running the same tests over and over, frowning at their instruments, adjusting their parameters, and frowning again. On the second day, the lead researcher, a senior Peluri named Dr. Tallon, called me into her office and told me the results were inconclusive. The blade was ordinary carbon steel, common on 1,000 worlds. The repair alloy was crude but unremarkable. A tungsten-carbon composite with trace elements that their instruments could not fully identify, but that appeared in negligible quantities. "There is nothing special about this weapon," Dr. Tallon said. She spoke carefully, the way Peluri always did, as if every word were being weighed on a scale. "The steel is inferior to even basic Coalition metallurgy. The repair work is frankly primitive. I cannot explain Commander Tysa's account, but I also cannot find a mechanism for what she describes." I felt something sink in my chest. Part of me had been terrified that they would find the answer and take the sword away. Part of me had been terrified that they would not find anything at all, and I would go back to being the human nobody listened to. But on the 3rd day, everything changed. I was sitting in the lab's waiting area when a junior researcher burst through the door with an expression I had never seen on a Peluri face before. Peluri were calm by nature, emotionally controlled to the point that most species thought they did not have feelings at all. This one looked like someone had set his hair on fire. His name was Dr. Olen, and he was young by Peluri standards, which meant he was probably older than my grandparents, but still considered inexperienced by his peers. He had been running a test that nobody else had thought to run, something he described as a dynamic micro-resonance scan, which measured the vibrational behavior of the blade's molecular structure under applied force. The fracture lines, he said, speaking so fast that his translator struggled to keep up. The fracture lines are the key. When force is applied to the blade, when it strikes something, the fracture lines vibrate at a specific molecular frequency. The repair alloy does not simply hold the broken pieces together. It creates a resonance pattern at the microstructural level. The two halves of the blade vibrate at slightly different frequencies because they are slightly different shapes, slightly different densities, and the alloy interface between them amplifies the difference. The result is a harmonic oscillation that propagates through whatever the blade strikes. He pulled up a holographic display and showed me a simulation. I did not understand the math, but I understood the image. The blade, cracked and repaired, vibrated like a tuning fork when it hit something, and the frequency of that vibration was very, very specific. Vreth bio-armor, Olen continued, his eyes wide, is a living crystalline lattice. It is nearly indestructible because it absorbs kinetic energy and redistributes it across the entire lattice structure. Hit it with a bullet, and the impact energy spreads across 1,000 crystalline bonds. Hit it with a plasma bolt, and the thermal energy is conducted away faster than it can accumulate. This is why no weapon in the Coalition arsenal has ever been able to penetrate it. He paused and looked at me with something that might have been wonder. But every crystalline lattice has a natural resonant frequency, he said. A frequency at which the lattice's own structure works against it. Hit it at that frequency, and instead of absorbing the energy, the lattice amplifies it. The bonds do not redistribute the force. They multiply it. The armor does not stop the blade. It tears itself apart. Like a singer breaking a glass, I said. Olen blinked. Yes, exactly like that. Your blade's fracture resonance matches the natural frequency of Vreth bioarmor. It does not overpower the armor. It makes the armor destroy itself. I stared at the simulation, the cracked blade, the ugly repair job, the trace element from a flea market meteorite. My grandfather had accidentally created the only weapon in the galaxy that could kill a Vreth, and he had done it with a propane burner and a coffee can. Can you replicate it? I asked. Olen's excitement dimmed slightly. Not yet. The frequency is incredibly precise. Even a minor deviation renders it ineffective, and the trace element in your grandfather's alloy is what tunes the resonance. Until we identify it and find a source, we cannot mass-produce the effect. I nodded. But you can build something? A prototype? In theory, a resonance emitter that generates the correct frequency through direct contact. It would not be elegant, it would not be safe, and it would have a working range of perhaps 2 meters. 2 meters is enough, if you are close enough. Olenin looked at me like I had suggested jumping out of a spacecraft without a suit, but he went to work. Coalition High Command was skeptical. Director Kale read Olen's report twice and asked 3 different scientists to verify the findings. The Kethoran dismissed it as theoretical nonsense. The Peluri Diplomatic Corps wanted more testing before any resources were committed. Everyone had opinions, and none of them involved urgency. Then the Vreth attacked again. They came in force this time. Not a raiding party or a probe, but a full-scale ground assault aimed directly at the secondary base. Thousands of shock troopers supported by armored crawlers and aerial drones, hitting our defensive lines like a wave hitting a seawall. The ground shook with the rhythm of their advance, and the sky turned dark with their ships. Within 2 hours, the outer perimeter fell. Within 4, the secondary line buckled. Coalition soldiers fought with everything they had, and it made no difference. Plasma bolts bounced off Vreth armor. Kinetic rounds shattered against their bodies. The Kethoran threw themselves at the enemy, with their war axes and their battle cries, and they died bravely and uselessly. I found Olen in his lab, surrounded by burning equipment and shattered instruments. The prototype resonance emitter sat on his workbench, half-finished and sparking. It looked like a metal cylinder wrapped in copper wire, with a handle that had been bolted on as an afterthought. "Is it ready?" I asked. "It is barely functional. The power regulation is unstable. The emitter coil overheats after approximately 45 seconds of sustained use. The effective range is less than 2 meters, and even at that range, the resonance field is inconsistent. There is a 30% chance it will work on any given strike, and a significant chance it will simply explode in your hand." I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, and it hummed against my palm like something alive. "Everyone else has better weapons than this," I said, "and none of them are working." I walked out of the lab and headed for the front line. Behind me, I heard Olen say something in Peluri that my translator did not catch. It might have been a prayer, it might have been a curse. It did not matter. The base was falling, and I was carrying the only weapon in the galaxy that had ever made a Vreth bleed. The corridor ahead of me was filled with smoke, and through it, I could see the shapes of Vreth shock troopers advancing in a tight formation. They moved with a mechanical precision that made them look less like soldiers and more like parts of a single machine, each one covering the blind spots of the one beside it, their forearms holding weapons that glowed with a cold blue light. Behind them, the walls were scored with plasma burns, and the floor was littered with Coalition dead. I pressed myself against a doorframe and checked the resonance emitter. The power indicator flickered between green and yellow, and the housing was already warm to the touch. Olen had said 45 seconds of sustained use before it overheated. I needed to make every second count. Colonel Marsh found me there. She came around the corner with a squad of Terran soldiers, 6 humans with empty magazines and hard eyes. Behind them were 2 Solari volunteers, both carrying neural blades, and 1 Kethoran warrior whose armor was scorched and cracked from fighting. "Corporal," Marsh said, "Director Kale has authorized a close assault team to attempt a counterpush through the Vreth breaching column. Tysa recommended you lead it." I looked at the squad. Danny Price, a lance corporal from Cardiff, who had been with the attachment for 2 years and had the steadiest hands I had ever seen. Kate Harlow, a sergeant who had transferred from the Royal Marines and never let anyone forget it. 4 others whose names I knew and whose families I did not want to think about. The 2 Solari said nothing. The Kethoran, whose name was Brevik, looked at the resonance emitter in my hand with open contempt. "What is that thing?" Brevik asked. "The only weapon that works," I said. He snorted. "Then we are already dead." I did not argue. I did not give a speech. I looked at my squad and said, "Stay close. The emitter has a range of 2 meters. When I engage a Vreth, I need you to keep the others off me, long enough for me to make contact. You cannot hurt them with your weapons, but you can slow them down. Use terrain, use obstacles, use anything." Danny nodded. Kate checked her weapon out of habit, even though it was empty. The Solari adjusted their neural blades. Brevik drew his plasma axe and said nothing. We moved into the smoke. The first Vreth saw us before we saw it. It came out of a side corridor, 4 arms swinging, and caught one of the human soldiers across the chest. He went down hard and did not get up. I lunged forward and pressed the emitter against the Vreth's torso. The device hummed, then shrieked, and the bio-armor under my hand cracked like ice on a frozen lake. The creature stumbled, and I pushed harder. The cracks spread. The armor split. The Vreth fell. "It works," Kate breathed. "Keep moving," I said. We fought our way into the Vreth formation, and it was nothing like any combat I had ever experienced. Normal firefights happened at range, behind cover, with time to think between shots. This was close enough to smell them, close enough to feel the heat of their bodies and the vibration of their footsteps through the floor. Every engagement was face-to-face, arm's length, with the emitter pressed against bio-armor that cracked and shattered under a frequency that the Vreth had never evolved to withstand. We killed 7 in the first corridor. The emitter overheated twice, and each time we had to fall back and wait while it cooled, pressed against walls with Vreth closing in from both directions. Danny used a fire extinguisher from the wall to cool the housing, and it bought us an extra 30 seconds of operating time. Kate organized the squad into rotating cover positions, keeping the Vreth at bay with improvised barricades and sheer stubbornness. The Solari fought like machines, precise and silent. using their neural blades to target the cracks the emitter created. They could not break bioarmor on their own, but once the resonance shattered the lattice, their blades could find the gaps. It was ugly, desperate teamwork, but it worked. Brevak was the one who surprised me. The Keth Oran warrior who had called the emitter useless threw himself at a Vreth shock trooper, with his plasma axe blazing, not to kill it, but to pin it in place long enough for me to close the distance. The axe bounced off the bioarmor, but the impact drove the creature back, and I pressed the emitter against its flank. The armor cracked. The Vreth fell. Brevik looked at me with an expression I could not read. We pushed deeper into the base, and the effect on the battle was extraordinary. Coalition soldiers who had been falling back in despair saw Vreth bodies on the ground. They saw the invincible enemy bleeding. For 4 years, the Vreth had been unstoppable. Now they were dying. The morale shift was not gradual. It was volcanic. Soldiers who had been retreating turned around and followed us, not because I ordered them to, but because for the first time in the war, they believed the enemy could be beaten. But I was not paying attention to morale. I was paying attention to the pattern of the Vreth assault. They were not pushing toward the command center. They were not trying to breach the armory or the communications hub. Their advance was focused, disciplined, and aimed like an arrow at one specific section of the base, the science division. "They know," I said. Kate looked at me. "Know what?" "About the resonance, about the emitter. They are not here to take the base. They are here to destroy the research." I did not have time to explain how that was possible. I just ran. The squad followed. We cut through 2 more Vreth blocking positions, and I burned through the emitter's power reserves faster than Olen had said was safe. The device was glowing orange by the time we reached the lab corridor, and I could feel the heat through my gloves. The lab door was blown open. Inside, equipment was smashed, data terminals were shattered, and the air smelled like burning plastic. Dr. Olen stood in the center of the wreckage with a sidearm in one hand and a data core in the other. 2 Vreth bodies lay at his feet. He had not killed them with the sidearm. He had rigged a focused resonance pulse from a piece of lab equipment and detonated it at point-blank range. The Peluri scientist who had never held a weapon in his life had improvised a bomb from his own research. "The data is intact," he said, holding up the core. His hands were steady, but his skin had gone so pale it was almost white. "The resonance frequency, the alloy analysis, the replication parameters, everything we need to build a proper weapon." I took the core and handed it to Danny. "Guard this with your life." We fought our way back to coalition lines. It took 40 minutes and cost us 2 more soldiers. The Keth Oran, Brevak, took a Vreth blast to the shoulder that shattered his armor and burned through to the bone. He kept fighting with one arm for another 10 minutes before the pain brought him down. As the medics pulled him onto a stretcher, he grabbed my wrist with his remaining good hand and pulled me close. "Your broken blade cuts deeper than my perfect one," he said. His voice was rough with pain, but his eyes were clear. I was the fool. The Vreth assault was repelled by nightfall, not because of our counterpush alone, but because our counterpush broke their momentum. They had expected to overrun the base unopposed. They had expected their bioarmor to make them invincible, as it always had. When the armor started cracking, when their soldiers started dying in the corridors, the shock disrupted their entire tactical framework. The Vreth did not know how to fight an enemy that could hurt them. The cost was high. Over 300 coalition soldiers dead, an entire wing of the base destroyed, 2 Solari platoons wiped out. The medical bays were overflowing, and the sound of the wounded carried through the walls like a low, continuous moan. I sat in the wreckage of the lab with Olen and watched the emitter cool on the floor. It was warped from the heat, the copper coils blackened and bent. It would never fire again. "Can you build another one?" I asked. "I can build something better," Olen said quietly. "Given time and resources, I can build a weapon that can be mounted on a ship, something that can project the resonance frequency at range, at scale. If the frequency shatters bioarmor on a soldier, it will shatter bioarmor on a warship. Their fleet will be just as vulnerable as their ground troops. How long? Weeks, maybe days if the coalition gives me everything I need." I nodded. Then I told him what I had realized during the assault. The Vreth knew about the resonance. They were targeting this lab specifically. Somebody told them. Olen's pale skin went even paler. A traitor. Inside Coalition Command. Someone with access to classified research data. Before he could respond, Colonel Marsh came through the door with an intelligence officer. Her face was set in hard lines, and she held a datapad that she placed on the table in front of me. Coalition intelligence has confirmed your suspicion, she said. Communication intercepts show that the Vreth received detailed information about the resonance research 72 hours before the assault. The leak came from inside the command structure. She paused and looked at me with eyes that held no comfort. There is more. Long-range sensors have detected a Vreth war fleet converging on this system. Not a task force, not a raiding group, a full battle fleet. 47 capital ships, including 3 dreadnoughts. They are coming to destroy everything we have built here. Every scrap of data, every prototype, every scientist who knows the frequency. How long? I asked. 6 days. I looked at Olen. He looked at his ruined lab, his broken equipment, and the burned-out emitter on the floor. Then he looked at me. I will need the original sword, he said. The prototype data is not precise enough for ship-scale calibration. I need the exact resonance signature, and the only perfect source is the blade itself. I drew the sword. In the dim light of the ruined lab, I could see new cracks running through the steel, damage from the battle. The blade that had already been broken once was breaking again. If I use it for calibration, Olen said carefully, the process will stress the molecular structure beyond recovery. The sword will not survive. I held the blade in my hands and felt the weight of 200 years. My grandfather's hands. His father's hands. The hands that carried it at Dover, and the hands that pieced it back together with scraps and stubbornness. The last thing I had from home, the last piece of earth that was truly mine. I held it out to Olen. He took it gently, like it was made of glass. The next 4 days were the longest of my life. Olen and his team worked around the clock in a makeshift lab that the engineering corps had built from shipping containers and salvaged equipment. The original lab was a ruin, but Olen did not seem to care. He worked with the focus of a man who understood that the clock was ticking and that nothing else mattered. I was not a scientist. I could not help him build the weapon. But Tysa gave me something else to do, something that I had not expected, and that most of the Coalition's senior officers considered absurd. She gave me the task of finding the traitor. You are the one who identified the leak, she said. We were in her quarters, and she was standing on her newly healed leg with the careful balance of someone who did not fully trust the repair. The intelligence division has been searching for the source for 6 hours and has found nothing. They are looking for technological evidence, communication intercepts, data breaches, electronic fingerprints. And you want me to look for something else? I want you to look the way humans look. You are not the smartest species in this coalition. You are not the strongest. But I watched you carry me across open ground with a broken sword on your hip, and I have been paying attention ever since. Humans see things that other species miss. Not because your eyes are better, but because you look at problems from an angle that the rest of us do not understand. I took the job. Colonel Marsh assigned me 2 intelligence analysts from the Terran attachment. A man named Greg Dunham, who had been a police detective before he enlisted, and a woman named Sophie Britton, who specialized in communication patterns. Together, we went through every classified communication that had passed through Coalition Command in the last 30 days. The electronic evidence was clean. Whoever had leaked the information had not used standard communication channels. They had not sent a message. They had not made a transmission. The data had simply appeared in Vreth hands, as if it had been conjured out of thin air. Greg looked at the problem like a detective. Forget the how, he said. Focus on the who. Who had access to the resonance data? Who knew about it before the attack? We built a list. It was short. Director Kale and his staff, Commander Tysa, Dr. Tolan and the senior science team, Colonel Marsh, and the Coalition's Strategic Command Council, which included senior officers from each member species of the Pact of 12. Sophie mapped the timeline. The Vreth assault was precisely targeted at the lab. That requires detailed floor plans, research schedules, and personnel locations. The leak was not just about the resonance frequency. Someone gave them an operational briefing. I stared at the map and thought about angles. The Solari were meticulous, but loyal to the coalition beyond question. The Kethoran were too proud to surrender anything to an enemy. The human contingent was too junior to have access to the level of detail the Vreth had received. That left one species with the means, the access, and something that none of the others had. A reason. The Peluri were diplomats. They were analysts. They were the species that saw the war not as a fight to be won, but as a problem to be solved. And they solved problems with calculation, not courage. I went to Sophie and asked her to pull the private communications of every senior Peluri officer in the command structure. Not their official channels, which were clean. Their personal messages. Their private diplomatic correspondence. The things they said to each other when they thought nobody was listening. It took 18 hours. But when Sophie laid the results in front of me, the picture was clear. Admiral Sorath was the highest-ranking Peluri officer in the Orden system. He had served the Coalition for 20 years, and his record was spotless. He was calm, measured, and universally respected as a voice of reason in strategic discussions. He was also the one who had argued most forcefully against committing resources to the resonance weapon program, calling it unproven, and recommending that the Coalition focus on evacuation planning instead. His private communications told a different story. Over the past 3 months, Sorath had been in contact with a neutral trade delegation that operated in the border zone between Coalition and Vreth space. The messages were encrypted with Peluri diplomatic ciphers, but Greg knew a signals analyst who owed him a favor, and the encryption broke after 4 hours of sustained effort. The messages were negotiations. Sorath was offering the Vreth detailed intelligence on Coalition military operations in exchange for a guarantee, the safety of the Peluri homeworld. He had calculated, with the mathematical precision of his species, that the Coalition could not win the war. The Vreth were too strong, too numerous, too well-armored. Every battle was a loss. Every campaign was a retreat. In Sorath's analysis, the war was already over, and the only question was how many species would be destroyed before the Coalition admitted defeat. His solution was simple and cold. Trade the resonance data to the Vreth. Let them destroy the weapon before it could be developed. Then negotiate a separate peace for the Peluri, sacrificing the other 11 species to buy his people's survival. I found Sorath in his quarters at 3 in the morning. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing fleet dispositions on a holographic display. He did not look surprised to see me. He did not look anything at all. His Peluri features were perfectly composed, and his color-shifting skin was a neutral gray. "Corporal Vane," he said, "I expected someone of higher rank. I am who they sent." He looked at me for a long time. "You have found the communications." "Yes." "Then you know what I have done, and you know why." I sat down across from him, not because I wanted to have a conversation, but because I wanted to understand. Sorath was not a villain. He was not greedy or cruel or power-hungry. He was a man who had looked at the numbers and decided that some people had to die so that others could live. I had seen that calculation before. Humans had made it 1,000 times throughout history. It never ended the way the calculator expected. "The war cannot be won," Sorath said. "I have run every projection, every scenario. Even with the resonance weapon, the Vreth have superior numbers, superior logistics, and superior strategic depth. You may crack their armor, but you cannot crack their empire. The best outcome the Coalition can achieve is a prolonged stalemate that bleeds every member species dry. You do not know that. I know mathematics. I know probability. I know that the Peluri have 47 billion citizens on our homeworld, and that every day this war continues, the likelihood of our total annihilation increases by a measurable percentage. I will not watch my people die for a broken sword and a theory." I leaned forward. My grandfather fixed that sword with scraps because he believed things should be mended, not thrown away. He did not calculate the odds. He did not run projections. He just knew that giving up was worse than failing. Sorath's skin shifted to a darker gray. "Your grandfather was a sentimental fool." My grandfather was right. The sword held. It has held for 200 years, and 3 days ago, it killed a creature that your entire species could not scratch. One soldier, one kill. That does not win a war. No, but a weapon based on that kill might. And you would have destroyed it to save your own people while the rest of the galaxy burned. Yes, Sorath said quietly. I would have. Because that is what leadership requires. Impossible choices made with imperfect information. You are a corporal. You do not understand what it means to hold a civilization's survival in your hands. I stood up. Humans have held that weight before. We have faced extinction more than once. And every time, the people who sacrificed others to save themselves lost everything anyway. Not because the math was wrong, but because the math does not account for the things that matter most. Stubbornness, hope, the refusal to abandon someone just because the odds are bad. I walked to the door and paused. The sword broke because someone swung it in a war where both sides were wrong. It held together because someone decided to fix it instead of throwing it away. That is the difference between your calculation and my grandfather's alloy, Admiral. You are trying to survive. We are trying to hold. Sorath was arrested within the hour. Director Kale and Commander Tysa handled it quietly, without spectacle. The Admiral did not resist. He walked to the brig with the measured steps of a man who had accepted his fate long before it arrived. The Vreth lost their intelligence source, but the damage was already done. Sorath's final transmission had given the enemy our defensive timeline, our fleet positions, and our weapon development schedule. The Vreth war fleet adjusted its approach vector and accelerated. Olin found me in the corridor outside the brig. His face was drawn, and his hands were trembling, but not from fear. He was holding a datapad that showed a power curve I could not interpret. The ship-scale weapon is at 70% completion, he said. I need another 2 days to finish the emitter array and calibrate the frequency projector, but there is a problem. Tell me. The prototype calibration data is not precise enough. There is a variance of 0.03% in the resonance frequency, and at ship scale, that variance could mean the difference between shattering a Vreth hull and merely scratching it. I need to recalibrate from the original source. The sword. Yes, I have been using it for incremental calibration throughout the build process. Each calibration stresses the blade further. It has cracked in 2 additional locations since I began. One more calibration cycle will give me the precision I need, but the stress will destroy the blade entirely. I closed my eyes. I had known this was coming. I had handed the sword to Olen, knowing that it might not survive, but knowing and feeling are different things, and the weight of it sat on my chest like a stone. Do it, I said. Olen nodded and left. I stood in the corridor alone, and I tried to remember the last time I had held the sword in my hands. The weight of it, the way the cracked steel caught the light, the ugly gray line of my grandfather's alloy running through it like a scar that refused to fade. 2 hours later, Olen sent me a message. Calibration complete. The sword was gone. 2 fragments of cracked steel and a smear of gray alloy were all that remained. But the weapon was ready, and the Vreth fleet had arrived early. The first Vreth ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Orden system, like dark stones falling into still water. Long-range sensors painted them across the tactical display in the flagship's command center, and I watched the red icons multiply until the screen looked like it was bleeding. 47 capital ships, 3 dreadnoughts, each one 6 kilometers long, their hulls covered in the same bioarmor that protected their ground troops. 12 heavy cruisers, 32 support vessels, and behind them, barely visible on the sensors, a command carrier that dwarfed everything else in the formation. The Coalition fleet had 19 ships. I stood at the back of the command center aboard the flagship, a Solari vessel called the Resolve. I was not supposed to be there. A corporal did not belong on a flag bridge surrounded by admirals and fleet commanders, but Tysa had insisted, and Director Kale had agreed, and so I stood in my rumpled uniform with no rank worth mentioning, and watched the most powerful military minds in the Coalition stare at a tactical display that told them they were going to die. The resonance weapon is mounted on the destroyer Talon, Olen reported from the engineering station. He had refused to stay planetside. He said he needed to monitor the weapon's performance in real time, but I think the truth was simpler than that. He had built it. He wanted to see if it worked. The weapon is fully calibrated and operational. Effective range is approximately 1,200 meters. The emitter requires a 90-second recharge cycle between firings. Director Kale studied the display. 1,200 meters, against a fleet that will engage at thousands of kilometers. The resonance effect propagates through the target's bioarmor lattice, Olen said. At 1,200 meters, the frequency is strong enough to initiate cascading structural failure. At greater ranges, the signal diffuses below the threshold for lattice disruption. We need to be close. Suicidally close, the Cellari tactical officer said. Yes, Olen agreed. The battle plan was built around that single constraint. The entire coalition fleet existed to do one thing: protect the Talon long enough for it to fire the resonance weapon at the Vreth dreadnoughts. Everything else was secondary. Every other ship was a shield for the one weapon that could hurt the enemy. The Vreth came in fast. They had never needed to be cautious. Their bio-armored hulls had shrugged off everything the coalition had ever thrown at them, and their tactical doctrine reflected that confidence. They advanced in a broad formation, spreading out to envelop the coalition fleet, cutting off escape routes with the efficiency of predators who had never met prey that could bite back. The first exchange of fire was one-sided and brutal. Coalition weapons lit up the void with plasma, kinetics, and directed energy, and every round bounced off Vreth bioarmor the way it always had. The Vreth returned fire with their own weapons, and coalition ships began to take damage. The destroyer Mantis lost its forward section to a Vreth beam weapon. The cruiser Steadfast took 3 direct hits and began venting atmosphere from its starboard compartments. I stood on the bridge and watched people die on the tactical display, represented by yellow icons that turned red and then went dark. Each dark icon was a ship. Each ship was a crew. Each crew was families and friends, and lives that would never go home. Talon is in position, the tactical officer announced. Range to lead Vreth dreadnought, 1,400 meters and closing. Hold fire until 1,200, Olen said. His voice was steady, but I could see his hands shaking. The frequency must be at full strength for the first shot. If it works, it changes everything. If it does not, nothing else matters. 1,200 meters, 1,150, 1,100. Fire, Director Kale said. The Talon fired. I could not see the resonance beam. It was not a visible spectrum emission, but I could see the result. On the tactical display, the lead Vreth dreadnought's hull integrity reading, which had been a solid, unchanging green since the beginning of the war, flickered. Then it dropped. Then it collapsed. On the visual feed, the dreadnought's hull cracked. Not a small crack, not a hairline fracture. The bioarmor, 6 kilometers of living crystalline lattice that had withstood every weapon the coalition possessed, split open like an egg struck with a hammer. The fractures propagated at the speed of sound through the lattice, spreading across the hull in a web pattern that I recognized instantly. It was the same pattern I had seen on the Vreth soldier's chest in the corridor of the forward base. The same web of cracks, the same cascading failure, the same principle, scaled up from a sword blade to a starship. The dreadnought broke apart, not exploded, broke. Its hull separated along the fracture lines, and the atmosphere inside rushed out in white plumes that crystallized in the vacuum. Secondary explosions ripped through the interior as containment systems failed. The largest warship in the Vreth fleet, the most powerful single vessel in the known galaxy, came apart in 17 seconds. The bridge of the Resolve was silent. Every officer, every analyst, every technician stared at the tactical display with the same expression. I had seen that expression before, on the faces of coalition soldiers when I killed the first Vreth with the sword. It was the look of people who had been told something was impossible, and then watched it happen. Confirmed kill, the tactical officer said, and her voice cracked on the second word. But the Vreth were not finished. They adapted faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, the remaining fleet shifted formation, condensing from their broad envelopment into a tight, layered defense. The 2 surviving dreadnoughts pulled back behind screens of heavy cruisers. Support vessels moved to intercept any approach toward the capital ships. The Vreth were afraid, perhaps for the first time in their species' military history, and fear made them dangerous. The Talon fired again during the recharge window. The second shot hit a heavy cruiser at the edge of effective range. The bio-armor cracked, but did not shatter completely. The ship was damaged, trailing atmosphere, but it held together. Olenin cursed in Peluri and began adjusting the emitter's frequency alignment. "They are adapting their formation to keep us at range," the tactical officer reported. "They are using their support vessels as a screen. We cannot close to effective range without fighting through the screen, and our fleet does not have the firepower to clear it." I watched the display and saw what the alien tacticians were missing. The Vreth were not just defending, they were hurting. The screen of support vessels was not static, it was moving, slowly, deliberately, pushing the coalition fleet backward and to the left. They were creating a corridor, a gap in their own formation that looked like a weakness, but was not. "They are setting up a ram," I said. Every head on the bridge turned to look at me. I was a corporal. I had no business speaking on a flag bridge, but Tysa was standing behind me, and she did not tell me to be quiet. "Look at the corridor," I said, pointing at the display. "They are funneling us into a narrow approach. If we take the bait and push through the gap to reach the dreadnoughts, we will be in a confined space with no room to maneuver. And that support vessel on the far flank, the one that has been lagging behind, is not damaged. It is accelerating. It is going to come through the corridor at full speed and hit the Talon head-on." The tactical officer checked my analysis. Her expression shifted from skepticism to alarm. "He is right. The lagging vessel has increased speed by 40% in the last 90 seconds. Current trajectory puts it on a direct collision course with the Talon. Time to impact, 4 minutes. Reposition the fleet," Director Kale ordered. "Close the corridor. Block the approach vector." The coalition fleet moved, and the Vreth suicide run was intercepted by 2 Solari cruisers that placed themselves directly in the oncoming vessel's path. The collision destroyed all 3 ships. The blast wave rocked the Resolve hard enough to throw me against the bulkhead, and for a moment the lights flickered, and the tactical display went dark. When the systems came back online, the situation was worse. The suicide attack had been a distraction. While the coalition repositioned to block the corridor, the Vreth had used the window to push their remaining dreadnoughts further back, beyond the resonance weapon's effective range. The Talon could not reach them without breaking through the entire Vreth screen, and the coalition fleet did not have enough ships left to force a path. "The weapon is cycling," Olen reported. "The emitter array is overheating. I can manage 1, possibly 2 more shots before the system needs to cool completely, and the calibration fragments from the sword are nearly depleted. Each shot degrades the reference frequency slightly." 1 or 2 more shots. Against a fleet that had learned to stay out of range. Against an enemy that was adapting in real time to a weapon they had never faced before. I looked at the display and thought about my grandfather. I thought about a broken sword fixed with scraps. I thought about a man who never calculated the odds, because he believed that holding together was more important than being whole. "Broadcast the frequency," I said. Olen looked at me. "What?" "The resonance frequency. Broadcast it, on all channels. To every ship in the fleet, let every species have it." The tactical officer shook her head. "That frequency is the most classified piece of information in the coalition. If we broadcast it openly, every species in the Pact of 12 will have it. Every government, every military. It changes the balance of power in the galaxy permanently." "Good," I said. Director Kale turned from the display. His expression was unreadable. "Explain, Corporal." "Our ships cannot generate a focused resonance beam. They do not have the equipment, but if they know the frequency, they can tune their existing weapons to approximate it. Plasma emitters, kinetic accelerators, directed energy arrays. Every weapon system has a frequency modulation setting. It will not be as powerful as the Talon's focused beam. It will not crack a dreadnought in 1 shot. But if every ship in the fleet hits the Vreth at rough resonance frequency simultaneously, the combined effect could cascade across their entire formation." "Could," Kale repeated. "My grandfather fixed a broken sword with scraps because he believed things should be mended, not hoarded. If we hold this frequency back to keep power for ourselves, we are no different from Sorath. He traded the frequency to save 1 species. I am asking you to share it, to save all of them." Kale looked at Tysa. She nodded once. "Broadcast it," Kale said. The resonance frequency went out on every channel, encrypted and unencrypted, military and civilian. Every coalition ship received it simultaneously, along with a set of instructions that Olen dictated in real time, explaining how to modify standard weapons to approximate the harmonic. It took 90 seconds for the first ship to respond. Then 10. Then all of them. The coalition fleet opened fire. It was not precise. It was not elegant. Every ship in the fleet was firing weapons that had been jury-rigged in minutes, tuned to a frequency that their systems were never designed to produce. The resonance effect was rough, uneven, inconsistent. Some shots bounced off Vreth bioarmor the way they always had. Some cracked the surface without penetrating. Some missed the harmonic entirely. But some hit. And when hundreds of weapons from dozens of ships hit at rough resonance frequency simultaneously, the effect was not a single crack. It was an earthquake. The resonance cascaded through the Vreth fleet's bioarmor, the way a vibration cascades through a crystal, each impact reinforcing the next, each crack weakening the lattice for the shot that followed. Ships that could withstand a single focused beam could not withstand 1,000 imperfect ones, all tuned to the frequency that made their armor tear itself apart. The first Vreth cruiser shattered, then another. Then the bioarmor on the second dreadnought began to crack in a dozen places simultaneously, fracture lines spreading across its hull like frost on glass. The great ship groaned, a sound that carried through space on vibration alone, and split along its length. The Vreth formation broke, not a tactical withdrawal, not an organized retreat. They broke the way glass breaks when you hit the resonance frequency, suddenly, completely, and all at once. Ships that had never known defeat turned and ran, and ships that could not run came apart under the sustained resonance bombardment. The Vreth fleet commander's signal came through on an open channel. It was a single word in the Vreth language, translated by the ship's systems into a word that nobody in the coalition had ever heard of Vreth say. Ceasefire. The bridge was silent. Then someone cheered. Then everyone did. Solari officers who had never shown emotion in their lives were gripping each other's arms. Peluri technicians were weeping. Ketharan warriors were roaring. And the humans, the junior species, the observers, the charity cases, who had been tolerated but never respected, stood among them and cheered too. I did not cheer. I stood at the back of the bridge and looked at the tactical display, at the wreckage of the Vreth fleet scattered across the void, and I thought about a cracked steel blade that was gone forever. 3 weeks later, I stood in the Coalition Assembly Hall on Orden 4. The room was vast, built to hold representatives from all 12 species of the Pact, and every seat was filled. The air hummed with translation systems working overtime, converting 100 languages into 100 more. I was wearing my dress uniform, the same corporal's rank on my collar that I had worn since the day I arrived. Nobody had promoted me. I had not asked them to. On a pedestal beside the podium where the peace accords were laid out for signing, 2 fragments of cracked steel sat in a clear case. The repair alloy was still visible, a thin gray line on each fragment where my grandfather's work had held the pieces together. The blade would never be whole again. The calibration process had stressed it beyond any hope of repair. But the case was positioned at the center of the hall, where every delegate could see it, because Director Kale had insisted. That blade ended a war, he had said. It belongs where everyone can see what it cost. The Vreth delegation entered the hall under a flag of truce, and the room went quiet. They were smaller than their shock troopers, leaner, with bio-armor that was more decorative than protective. Their fleet commander, a being whose name translated roughly as First Voice, stood before the assembly and spoke words that had never been spoken by a Vreth in recorded history. They asked for peace. The terms were negotiated over the next 2 days. I was not involved. I was a corporal, and peace treaties were above my rank. But I stood in the hall and watched, and I saw things that I had not expected to see. I saw the Ketharan delegation bow to the human contingent as they entered the chamber. A full bow, from the waist, the kind of gesture that the Ketharan reserved for warriors who had earned respect through blood. Warlord Drennick led the bow. His shoulder was still bandaged from the wound he had taken at Orden 4, and he moved stiffly, but his eyes were steady. After the first day's session, he found me in the corridor. He was carrying something wrapped in cloth, and he knelt before me with the deliberate formality of a Keth-Oran warrior honoring a peer. He held out the bundle, and I unwrapped it. It was a sword, a new one, forged by Keth-Oran mastersmiths, from an alloy that gleamed like liquid silver. The balance was perfect, the edge was flawless. The craftsmanship was the finest I had ever seen, and every line of the blade spoke of a tradition that stretched back thousands of years. It was beautiful. A warrior's blade for a warrior's hand, Drennick said. I held the sword and felt its weight. It was lighter than my grandfather's blade, sharper, stronger in every measurable way. I thanked him, and I meant it. Then I walked to the pedestal where the broken fragments sat in their case, and I laid the new sword beside them. Drennick watched me with an expression I could not read. I will carry this one, I said, touching the Keth-Oran blade. It is a fine weapon, and I am honored. But that one, the broken one, that is the one worth remembering. Drennick looked at the fragments, then he looked at me, and then he did something I had never seen a Keth-Oran do. He smiled. That night, after the second session, Tysa came to find me on the observation deck of the assembly building. The sky above Orden 4 was clear, and I could see the stars that the Vreth had tried to take from us. She stood beside me in silence for a long time, and then she said something that I carry with me still. I left you behind at the forward base, she said. When the Vreth attacked, I retreated with my soldiers, and I did not check whether you were with us. I did not even think about it. I know. I would not do that again. I looked at her. Her black eyes reflected the starlight, and her face held none of the distant composure that I had come to expect from the Solari. She looked like a person. Just a person, standing in the dark, telling the truth. I know that too, I said. The peace accords were signed the next morning. 12 species and one former enemy put their marks on a document that ended 4 years of war and opened the door to something that none of them had dared to imagine. Not just peace, but partnership. The resonance frequency was shared openly with every member of the pact, just as I had demanded during the battle. No species owned it. No government controlled it. It belonged to everyone, because the weapon that won the war had been built from a broken blade that one man fixed with scraps instead of throwing away. I stood at the back of the hall and watched the delegates celebrate, and I felt the absence of the sword in my hand like a missing limb. It was gone. The steel that my grandfather had shaped, the alloy he had poured, the careful repair that held 2 broken halves together for 2 centuries, all of it was gone, spent, used up in the act of saving everything else. But the fragments remained, and the story remained. And when historians write about the war, when they list the weapons and the strategies and the decisive moments, they will always come back to the same question: how did it end? How did a war that the galaxy was losing, a war against an enemy whose armor could not be broken, finally come to a close? It ended with a broken sword. They mocked it. Every species in the coalition looked at that cracked blade and saw a joke. They saw primitive craftsmanship and sentimental foolishness, and a junior species that did not know enough to be embarrassed. They saw everything except what mattered. They did not see my grandfather's hands, steady and sure, mixing alloy in a coffee can. They did not see 200 years of stubbornness, 200 years of refusing to let go of something just because it was damaged. They did not see the thing that humans have always known, and that the rest of the galaxy is only now beginning to understand. What has been broken and still holds is stronger than what has never been tested. They laughed at a broken blade carried by a species they thought had nothing to offer. But the galaxy learned something that day. Humans do not win because we are the strongest or the smartest. We win because when everything shatters, we are the ones stubborn enough to pick up the pieces and hold them together.